Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Migration Dialogues webinar titled Vadis ASEAN, the Future of International Migration in ASEAN Amidst COVID-19. My name is Stella Go. I am the convener of the Philippine Migration Research Network and a faculty member of De La Salle University. This webinar is the fifth in a series of migration dialogues within the context of the current global health crisis. The first webinar was in April, and it focused on the impact of COVID-19 on the overseas Filipino workers and their remittances. The second looked at the current situation of Filipinos in the UK, particularly our Filipino nurses and students. The third webinar put the spotlight on the state of our Filipino seafarers amidst COVID-19, and the fourth webinar in June discussed the challenges of return and reintegration of overseas Filipino workers in the light of the current pandemic. These webinars are brought to you by the Philippine Migration Research Network, or PMRN, with the support of the Philippine Social Science Council, or PSSC. PMRN is a network of individuals consisting mostly of social scientists and other professionals that was organized to advance knowledge and understanding of national and international migration trends and developments. Meanwhile, PSSC is a nonprofit organization of professional social science organizations and social science research and instructional institutions in the Philippines. It serves as the secretariat of the PMRN. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's webinar. She is a social scientist with extensive hands-on experience on migration policy and its planning in national and international work environments. She recently retired from the International Labor Organization as the Deputy Director responsible for Asia and the Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you Ms. Thetis Mangahas, our moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Thetis?
Thank you, Stella. I'm very pleased to be able to moderate today's session, the fifth in the series of PMRN and with the Philippine Social Science Council. As Stella had mentioned, the previous migration dialogues have focused mainly on the impacts of the pandemic on Philippine labor migration. Today, we are casting our sights over a much larger space, broadening our views to consider international migration flows in the ASEAN. This cluster of 10 countries hosts several million ASEAN migrants within the region. Our ASEAN major destination countries are Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. And our migrants are coming from Indonesia, Myanmar, Laos PDR, and Cambodia. But it's also true that our ASEAN migrants are also going beyond our borders. The Philippines and Vietnam, for example, are major sources of migrant workers in many parts of the world. We have this afternoon 5 distinguished Southeast Asian experts and panelists this afternoon. I'm looking forward to hear them share their thinking and their research findings on the impacts of COVID-19. It would also be very interesting to see what they're seeing as the shape of international labor migration in the ASEAN. We have structured presentations in 2. The first 3 will focus primarily on specific migration experiences and futures in the 3 countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And the second session, as part of the webinar, we'll look at the broader ASEAN effects of the ASEAN institutions and reports from the field. Let me introduce the 5 speakers. We're honored to have as our first speaker, Ms. Yuyun Wayunmingrum, the representative of Indonesia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Yuyun obtained her MA on Human Rights from Mahidol University and is now pursuing her PhD at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Yuyun is pursuing her research on state engagement with international human rights norms using the perspective of third world approaches to international law. Our second speaker is Ms. Lin Lim. Lin, a distinguished and well-known development economist from Malaysia, has had a powerhouse research career on issues of women in the informal sector and migration and human trafficking. She was my predecessor as Deputy Regional Director of the ILO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, certainly a mentor. And Lin has continued to be very active in research and advocacy, serving at the Board of Trustees for the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and as director of the Board of WAGO, a global research policy network. Our third speaker is Mr. Geoffrey Ducanes, an associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics. His research covers a wide range of interests, including labor migration, of course, education, poverty, and inequality. In 2014, he was named as an outstanding young scientist, a rare honor for social scientists in this country, by the National Academy of Science and Technology. Our fourth speaker is Ms. Catherine Laws, the ILO's Regional Officer for the Safe and Fair Program, a labor migration program, which is a collaborative undertaking of the ILO and UN Women. Kat, in the last 10 years, have been working intensively on issues of migration and trafficking at both the national and regional levels. Ms. Johanna Son is the fifth panelist. She's Bangkok-based, the editor and founder of Reporting ASEAN Series, an independent venue for in-depth reportage and capacity building around the analysis of regional issues. She writes analysis for the Bangkok Post and contributes to the Nikkei ASEAN Review, Asian Review, among others. Before I move to Yuyun, I'd like to encourage all of our listeners to put in their comments or their questions in the chat section of the video so that we can answer. We will have 2 questions and answers. The first short session will be after the first 3 speakers, and then at the end of the seminar. So Yuyun, shall you start?
Thank you very much, PNRM. And thank you very much, Chair, for having this kind of conversation. This is very timely, and it's something that we need to discuss, the issue that's very important to be discussed in this region, as well as in Indonesia. So I prepared my presentation. We can go next. My outline for this presentation will cover situation of migrant workers in destination countries, in repatriation phase and at home country. And this is the question that I have been lingered so far in, is how has the COVID-19 reshaped the narrative of migration for the future or after, right after the COVID-19. I will just skip the ASEAN responses presentation because there will be speakers to talk about this. Next, please. So in terms of the situation of migrant workers in destination countries, I put here some of the survey, the current survey made by the ASEAN Migrant coordinating body, as well as from Human Rights Working Group, which actually similar finding, even though it was located in different countries. ASEAN Migrant Coordinating Body did the research on Indonesian migrant workers in Hong Kong, while HRWG did the research, a survey on migrant workers in Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore. So they are in fear or already lose job, difficult to access social protection and healthcare in destination countries. Indonesian migrant workers also living in fear of being raided or detained by the authorities, xenophobia, discrimination, hatred because of their immigration status. They also deal with the stigma of carrying the virus, even though they're already in the country for some time. They also get starved because they don't have a daily wage. So this is the situation in which many migrant workers face in destination country. so far, since January 2020, there are about 130,000 Indonesian migrant workers return with different kind of medium, whether they return independently or facilitated by the governments or any other ways of return home. Next, please. In the stage of repatriation, some migrant workers also said that they are trapped in the country without contract, expired working permit, and movement restriction. So no transportation, so they cannot move from one place, or from their house or their resident to the bus terminal or anything like that. So they are trapped into this kind of movement restriction. And they also continue to mention that they are very afraid of being detained and also vulnerable. They are vulnerable because of the immigration status. They also fear of being infected by COVID-19. At home, so those who have been reaching home, they are unemployed, no daily wages, similar like in the destination countries. They also receive stigma from people surrounding that they are carrying the virus, even though they have been quarantined for 14 days. And they are also excluded from social protection and safety net that governments establish. And they suffered from the economic crisis as an impact of the COVID-19 at the household level, the community level. Next. So having this kind of situation, I actually worried about how COVID-19 shaped the way we understand migration, or the narrative of migration itself in the region or globally. So my office, ICHR Indonesia, has been monitoring the situation of human rights in the region during COVID, and we note down some of the narratives, like COVID-19 put the spotlight on the crucial role on the protection and promotion of economic and social rights. Never before that our attention goes to economic and social rights, because we always talk about, whenever we talk about human rights, we put a lot of emphasis on civil political rights. And now with the COVID, our attention is more on economic and social rights. And COVID-19 also brought the attention on the critical and vitality role of migrant workers in many sectors, like those who are in the front as frontliners. They are working in healthcare industry and also in agriculture. And more and more we continue to hear that the health discourses is not only the basic rights, but also the economic, social, and security issue. And then with this kind of lockdown, there's a shift of migration rhetoric, which will have the long-term implication to social economic situation of the migrant workers and also the social cohesion. The fear of the other shift the migration rhetoric by expanding the focus to the individual risk on health security. And nowadays, more and more, I also continue to hear the health securitization rather than healthcare, or rather than basic rights, but it's more like health securitization as a new term, and how it contribute to the migration rhetoric. I assume there will be more difficulties that migrant workers will face in terms of accessing social protection, and it may exacerbate inequality, discrimination, and exploitation. There is also anti-migrant sentiment in a number of countries, and nowadays we saw and we continue to hear that in the region. Next. Now in the media and also in the last ASEAN summit, leaders introduced these travel bubbles, which immediately I I immediately I was worried because travel bubbles is the process of a human migration from one place to another, but only safe zones. Those the countries that are not considered as safe zones will not be able to travel at the moment. And that maybe create another difficulties for migrant workers, especially for the countries considered as red zones. And it may create a new form of economic isolation for especially for those who are considered as red zones. And also it didn't happen yet, but it might contribute to the enlarging the inequality between global and between North and South uh, 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 division. And I think next slide is it's about my recommendation to protection ways to better provide protection for migrant workers. So it would be good to include migrant workers in public health scheme and health emergency plan. As we saw in number of countries in ASEAN, for instance, destination countries did not include migrant workers in their response, so they get the second or third wave in terms of infectious cases. And this is perhaps the time to talk about portable universal health care in migration management to ensure that migrant workers um, uh, health insurance can be covered in different countries wherever they go. And I think last night I also realized that we need to start thinking about how to change this rhetoric of migration that developed so far in terms of discrimination, xenophobia, to more solidarity. And it requires a lot of participation. It requires a lot of commitment from individual and also from the governments. And now countries in ASEAN as well as the ASEAN as a regional organizations are planning about the recovery plan, and perhaps this is something that ASEAN need to consider and ASEAN member states need to consider. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yu Yun. It's been a short but very comprehensive discussion of what has happened with Indonesian workers. Of course, I think many common situations that we see across the whole of the ASEAN. Lin, can I ask you for your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, so I will just speak if it's okay. Certainly, the virus has not discriminated between nationals and foreign workers, but it has been the foreign workers in Malaysia, particularly the irregular migrants and the refugees who have been on the front line of the both the health risks and also the socio-economic impacts. Officially, the 2020 Malaysian budget estimated that there were 2.2 million foreign workers, but the irregular migrants have been estimated from between 1.2 million to something like 6 million, and we do not really have the figures for particularly the irregular migrants. In terms of health risks, the migrant workers have certainly borne the brunt of it because they have not received adequate information about how to protect themselves. They cannot afford to buy masks, but most importantly, because they live in overcrowded communal or work sites without running water, where they are not able to practice social distancing, where they are not able to constantly wash their hands. And we hear of increasing cases where they do not dare or they even resist testing or treatment because of fear of arrest and deportation. In terms of the socio-economic impacts, the Ministry of Human Resources actually came out with a statement that said that if there have to be layoffs, it is the foreign workers who should be the first to be laid off. And there have been numerous reports of the large number of workers who have lost their jobs because of the closure of the large, factories producing garments and textiles, and also the Malaysian Trade Union Congress has reported many cases of unfair dismissals, unpaid wages, and for those who have been engaged in producing PPEs, particularly producing gloves, there have been many reports of occupational safety and health hazards and overwork because of the need to produce these masks. I think that a very serious development has been that these health and socioeconomic impacts have been intensified because of growing anti-immigrant xenophobic sentiments that have not only been propagated online on cyber attacks, but also by politicians and senior officials. And this has been very evident against the Rohingya refugees. Malaysia was one of the countries that had previously accepted them and given and helped them. But now the sentiment is growing very strongly. Yesterday, there was a report of a bread making company being boycotted because they were employing Rohingya refugees. The other aspect of it is that the legal migrant workers have been paying into social protection schemes, but all the current economic, emergency packages have not covered them at all. So although they've been paying, they are not eligible for support. So many migrant workers, or maybe I should say something about the domestic workers, because we have a lot of Indonesian and Filipino domestic workers who are now finding that they are working much longer hours because the family is all at home, but obviously they're not being paid extra or overtime. The other aspect, I think, is that those who are now, who were daily paid workers are now in really dire circumstances, and civil society groups and other organizations have been coming in to do a lot in terms of providing food, in terms of providing income support, and many of them say that they really are in very desperate circumstances, particularly the women who are finding it difficult to feed children. In terms of what can be done, these groups have actually have called for moratorium on the raids that have been carried out. The immigration and the police and armed forces have been carrying out raids and detaining illegal or irregular migrants and putting them into detention centers. they've also called for amnesties, which really is what should be done now. In the longer term, as we look ahead, I think that it is very clearly critical that we do not take a short-term view of thinking that it's a short-term gain to get rid of migrant workers to adjust to the crisis. Because this short-term gain will certainly lead to a long-term pain. When we think about the Malaysian context has been one that has been very heavily dependent on migrant labor. And the need to relook the foreign worker policy has now clearly become very urgent and very necessary. Even long before the crisis, there have been growing concerns about the dependence on a cheap labor policy, which has really put constraints on productivity and also on the adoption of technology. So even before the crisis, there has been a lot of discussions going on about what can be done to really look at where the real needs for migrant workers are, what can be done to make the necessary adjustments, and to also at the same time better protect those migrant workers who are coming in under proper recruitment measures, and to also make sure that they are protected under social protection coverage and health coverage, etc. In terms, I think it may also be worth mentioning that there is another aspect to the whole migration issue in Malaysia, because at the same time as Malaysia is importing migrant workers, Malaysians are going out to work in Singapore. And certainly the lockdown has caused something like 40, officially the count is something like 40,000 daily commuters across the bridge, across the causeway every day to work in Singapore, who are now not able to do that. So the discussion earlier about these travel bubbles was also interesting, because there have been discussions between the Malaysian and Singapore authorities on what can be done to allow the flows. But at the same time, it raises the issue of why Malaysians are going to work in Singapore in the same jobs that they are not willing to do in Malaysia. And obviously part of it is related to wages and the level of wages. I think that I have exceeded my 10 minutes, so I'll stop here and maybe take questions or add in later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lin. I think it's, for us here in the Philippines, it's always interesting to see the perspective from a primarily migrant destination country such as Malaysia, and the kind of dynamics that really influence policy in that country. Also very interesting tidbit that, of course, Malaysians are going to Singapore on a daily basis, commuting, and that has had a major impact as well on these people's lives. Thank you very much, Lin. Let me move now to Jeff Ducanes. Jeff, your presentation, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I have a PowerPoint. I would like to request Miguel to put it on. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Ducanes from the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics. Next slide, please. So before I start, let me acknowledge first that in my short presentation, I will be drawing from a recently issued policy brief on COVID-19 and overseas Filipino workers, or OFWs, I co-wrote with the session's moderator, Ms. Vadis, herself a well-known migration expert. So I will structure my presentation as follows. First, I discuss what has been the impact on OFWs of the current crisis, then talk about what I think the future will look like for OFW migration, and then give a few recommendations. The impact on OFWs, I will discuss in terms of displacement, repatriation, and stranding. Next slide, please. As of June, late June, the global displacements of OFWs has already reached 182,000 workers, according to data from the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, or POEA. They got the data from labor attaches assigned in different destination countries. More than 3/4 of those displaced were workers in the Middle East, while 11% were from Europe and 5% were from the US. The numbers from Europe and the US reflect the loss of jobs of seafarers. Not all the displaced workers have come back to the country. The closure of government offices in many destination countries and the closure of airports to international travel, including Philippine airports, slowed the pace of repatriations. And when the Philippines did allow international travel, it was only for a very small number of passengers. This is to ensure the adequacy of COVID-19 testing and quarantine facilities. Next slide, please. So data from the Department of Labor and Employment and POEA show the number of repatriated OFWs as of the first week of July to total almost 50,000 workers, equivalent to around just 20% of total displacement. If you compare across destination countries, a larger share of OFWs displaced in Europe and the Americas were able to be repatriated because many of them were in cruise ships who early on were allowed to dock in Manila Bay, and the crew allowed to disembark. In contrast, repatriation of OFWs in the Middle East has been quite slow, started only in May and expanded in June and July, following pressure from destination governments, and then some reports, including YouTube videos of OFWs who have lost their jobs scrounging for food in the Middle East. The return to families in the home provinces outside of Metro Manila have been especially problematic. Despite the mandatory quarantine of 14 days and negative results of COVID-19 testing, several governors and mayors have refused OFWs to return to their home communities. And when accepted back, the OFWs were often required to undergo another round of testing and another round of quarantine. So in the early days, it's much better now, but in the early days, repatriated OFWs took sometimes a month, sometimes even more than a month to be able to return to their families. So as of end June, based on the POEA report, next slide please, there were still more than 40,000 Filipinos stranded, most of them in the Middle East. So note that all these things, especially the job losses for OFWs, have potentially big welfare implications on OFW households. So OFW households, if you look at the household survey data, most of them are highly dependent on remittances. And the loss of remittances can easily tip some of them into poverty. So on average, for example, an OFW household relies on remittances for 43% of their total household income. And for those in the lower income groups, the majority are actually women. Almost 3/4 of OFWs belonging to the poorest 40% of households are women, which suggests that they are those in elementary occupations, including domestic workers and services and sales workers, which are dominated by women. There's actually no data on what occupations are returning and the breakdown by gender. But if the OFWs losing their jobs are these ones, and they do not get it back or do not find new jobs immediately, it will have a huge negative impact on the welfare of their households. Next slide, please. So now I discuss what I think the outlook for future labor migration will be for the Philippines. If you look at recent data, actually the growth of Philippine overseas migration and even remittance inflows have actually been slowly declining in recent years. And the COVID-19 crisis is only certain to further reduce the pace of migration and change the profile of workers who migrate, especially in the next year or so. So for one, the expected global recession will drastically reduce the demand for oil, and so deployment to the Middle East will be drastically reduced as well. And in fact, we can probably expect more displacement in the Middle East in the coming months. In addition, it might be a long while before cruise ships become viable again, so there will be little, if any, deployment for the manning of cruise ships. In addition, while global trade could rebound from what it has been the past few months, it will be certainly weaker than what it was pre-COVID-19. This means that demand for seafarers who work on trade ships will also likely go down. The global recession will also affect manufacturing jobs abroad, as well as many services and sales work for OFWs. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So on the other hand, the demand for health workers will likely increase, both as a result of the need for other countries to bolster their health system and the aging of the population in many rich countries. The demand for IT workers will also likely continue, as well as the demand for essential workers in 3D or dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs in developed countries. But again, apart from COVID-19, you also have to take into account the political developments in Hong Kong, which could also affect the employment of domestic workers there. So overall, I think deployment will be much lower in the near future and will have a larger share of higher skilled workers, mainly health workers. So how do we improve the future of labor migration in the Philippines? So I give only 3 recommendations, and they intersect with the previous recommendations. So first, put a regional or global system in place to facilitate the return home of unemployed migrant workers to avoid a repeat of the stranding of the possibly hundreds of thousands of workers who have lost their jobs in the different countries. So this system should, for example, identify how it is to be financed, who is to organize it, and so on. Second, make Social Security portable across countries of origin and destination, or in the case of the Philippines, between the Philippines and the various destination countries. This is to strengthen the safety net for migrant workers whose families are often mostly dependent on remittances. And finally, reboot foreign employment by providing safe channels for repeat work. This might require new safe channels for foreign employment supported by bilateral and regional frameworks, and should provide for safe track green channels for work that would include digital processing of documents, agreed protocols for health testing, pre-departure training, and safe travel, and will also require the employers providing for personal protective equipment and uniforms for migrant workers. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think many of our listeners are aware of the very visible impacts of the pandemic, particularly in the imaging of overseas Filipino workers coming home. But perhaps for those who are not Filipino, an interesting feature of the way we monitor our numbers is that we include seafarers and cruise ship members. It's simply because of our admin systems, which include seafaring, and also because this has really been monitored for a long period of time. When almost like a fifth or a fourth of our overseas placements are actually for those bound for cruise ships, trade vessels, etc., cargo ships. That's just for further information. Thank you very much, Jeff. We look forward to hearing more questions later. We will stop for the moment and look at some of the questions which have come up. I will read some of them. From George Tigno, we see, do speakers see any possibility of backpedaling in ASEAN in terms relative to the 2007 declaration and the Covenant on the Rights of Migrant Workers? Can they comment on the effect of the pandemic on these two regional decisions? Perhaps we could answer that later, Georgette, because that will in fact be covered by our second set of speakers. Just want to inquire whether ASEAN countries already opened their doors for migrant workers. If yes, what policies and protocols are in place to protect them from possible risks? And then, of course, there's a question on Rohingya migrants in Malaysia. Are they given the refugees in Malaysia? Are they given the opportunity to work in the country? And then the last question we have here is how many of those displaced OFWs and migrant workers are women? Shall we start with, are the ASEAN countries opening up their doors? Maybe Lin, you could take this up. Are there already re-entrants to the Malaysian labor force for migrant workers, or is this still shut?
What do you mean opening their doors?
So are workers coming back? Those who have been repatriated are coming back to Malaysia. Are they being allowed back? Or are there new placements happening in Malaysia? Is recruitment ongoing?
Well, since Malaysia does not have really migrant workers in other countries, or Malaysians are not migrants in other countries except for the commuters to Singapore. The commuters have not been able to get back to Singapore, but they're slowly open. Singapore is slowly opening up for some categories of the workers.
Okay. Yuyun, you have any information? Yuyun, you're in mute.
You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Indonesia has a migrant workers from China. So we have received migrant workers, open borders for only them, because government said this is a delayed agreement that need to be implemented to certain area in which they are working on mining. There are a number of protests from people because people are very afraid of being infected by foreigners. But yeah, it's open for, there is a selective opening for migrant workers in Indonesia. But the Indonesian migrant workers cannot return or cannot go to Malaysia or Singapore or any other countries at the moment because of the closure of borders.
Jeff, you have any information? Thank you, Yuyun. Jeff, you have any information on that?
Only to note that it was in the news the other day that in Thailand, they will soon be admitting foreign workers again. So those who left because of COVID-19 will be allowed to come back, but subject to conditions like 14-day quarantine and so on.
Yes. Yeah. I also heard that these Laotian migrant workers return to Thailand by land border. They are allowed to return to Thailand.
I think also from here, there was a discussion, and maybe that's a completely different webinar, on how we've held back on our health workers, because there is, of course, a greater demand for health workers in Europe and in the US and other parts of Asia. And there was a decision by the government to stop their deployment or their going to these countries. But from what I hear, that they will be opening that up as well eventually to allow, I guess for some reasons or the other, but that has been one area of controversy in the country, the health workers, because they're still so very needed back home. Okay, perhaps what we could do, just to assure everybody that we will make the slides available of the presenters. But let's proceed now to the next session, to the next part, to our two other speakers, and then have a longer Q&A afterwards. Lin, you wanted to say something?
No, just to clarify that there was a question. You said Rohingyas.
Okay, Rohingya, yes.
But there is a work permit pilot project that is spearheaded by the Malaysian government and UNHCR that will allow Rohingya refugees that have official refugee status in Malaysia to work.
Quite progressive.
Crisis situation. I mean, the xenophobic, anti-refugee, anti-migrant sentiments have been growing very, very strong. And there have been recent reports of boats of Rohingya refugees being turned away. So that's been the situation.
All right. Okay, after those very rich presentations from our three country presenters, I'd like to invite now our Kat Laws from the ILO project, Safe and Fair Migration, to do her presentation. Thanks, Kat.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'm a pleasure to be here, and thank you to PMRN, Professor Stella Go, and Ms. Vadis for inviting me to present at this migration dialogue. So, shall we start? Next slide, please. So my presentation will briefly talk about the impact of COVID-19 on migrant workers, their vulnerabilities, as well as I'd like to share some of the experiences of migrant workers themselves as we've collected through our rapid assessment that we conducted early in the pandemic. So just to start, I wanted to give a quick overview of labor migration in ASEAN. So according to the UN DESA International Migration Stock for 2019, there are 21.8 million ASEAN migrants across the world. There are 10 million international migrants in the ASEAN sub-region. And in terms of intra-ASEAN flows, we see there are 6.8 million ASEAN migrants that are working, living within ASEAN countries of destination. According to ILO's International Migration Statistics database, we see that migrant workers in the ASEAN countries of destination comprise a significant part of the workforce. 37% of the workforce in Singapore, 28% in Brunei, 15% in Malaysia, and 3% of the workforce in Thailand. And I just wanted to emphasize that this, it may seem relatively small, but actually Thailand's labor force is actually much bigger than the three other countries of destination. And Thailand is actually the biggest country of destination for intra-ASEAN migration, which makes Thailand a crucial hub for migration in the region. And next slide, please. So as we've seen, the COVID-19 pandemic is not only a health crisis, it's also a crisis with detrimental effects on employment, income, social protection, freedom from violence and harassment, as well as access to services and access to justice mechanism. The ILO has been coming up with a monitor on COVID-19 and the world of work. In its second edition, it was released in April. It observed that the employment impacts of COVID-19 are deep, they're far-reaching and unprecedented. Employment has been impacted directly as a result of the lockdowns and other measures. And it's been a greater magnitude than initially predicted at the start of the pandemic, and it's continued to unravel now. The monitor also highlighted some of the key economic sectors that are at risk And these included among them the retail sectors, manufacturing, accommodation and food services, the services sector, construction, agriculture, forestry, fishing, and also the informal sector. So it made some observation about the detrimental effects the pandemic has had on workers in the informal sector. And I just wanted to point out that these are the same economic sectors where there are high numbers of migrant workers in the region. And we also see that women migrant workers are in domestic and care work, housekeeping, healthcare, and social work. And these are workers at the front lines of the pandemic, and they're at high risk of contracting the virus, and they're currently overburdened. Next slide. So migrant workers are among the vulnerable groups for a variety of reasons. It's been said by several of our presenters already. The living conditions for many do not favor social distancing, particularly in certain sectors, construction, plantation, and others where accommodations for migrant workers are provided. Migrant workers could also be continuing to work without sufficient personal protection equipment and continue to work in close proximity to each other. They may also be the first ones to be retrenched as employers choose to keep local workers. There's also a significant number of women migrant workers in informal employment with no labor protections and limited social protections. And as a cause of all this, we see that migrant workers have reduced earnings and therefore reduce remittances. And some of their remittance service providers were also closed during the lockdown, which then has a cascading effect on their families who are dependent on their remittances. Often migrant workers are also not included in unemployment insurance, even when they're included in other social protection schemes. And often they're also not included in relief measures, especially sometimes with this notion that migrant workers and their families may be better off than certain sections of society. And undocumented migrant workers have also been subject to detention in unsafe conditions. And they've also experienced challenges on their return. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. And of course, and this was true before COVID, it's more true now. They've had challenges in accessing services due to the movement restrictions. They can't go to the service providers, but we've also heard that some frontline service providers have had to close in full or partially due to the lockdowns, or they've had to redirect their efforts to emergency humanitarian work. And some have had to move to remote service delivery, which has its own limitation. Next slide, please. We've also seen that there's a greater risk of gender-based violence as heightened stress, anxiety, income insecurity. All of this can exacerbate the risk of violence for women, which includes women migrant workers, particularly say for domestic workers, for example. And there can be an additional risk of violence and harassment in migrant accommodation, which is exacerbated again or may increase during the lockdowns and quarantines are in place. And the movement restrictions may confine victims with their perpetrators, and as they're unable to reach their usual support networks or other service providers. And we've seen that there are some exploitation that may have been experienced while they're trying to return. So we've seen you've seen in some of the news that hotlines have responding to incidences of VOW have reported increased calls during the time of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So most of my presentations focused on the content of two papers. The first is of the experiences of ASEAN migrant workers during COVID-19. Due to time limitations, I'll focus on the findings of this paper. And the second paper on COVID-19 and women migrant workers in ASEAN, I've just integrated some of the key observations throughout my presentation. So next slide, please. So going to the rapid assessment that was conducted by various ILO labor migration projects in ASEAN. So we conducted the study rapid assessment between March and April 2020, so near the start of the pandemic. I'm not going to go through all the methodology through the time restriction. But I just wanted to highlight that the results are not representative. So the surveys were conducted by ILO's partners who are providing direct services to migrant workers, including through our migrant resource centers. These are being run by governments, trade unions, CSOs, and they're continuing to collect the data. So we're happy to note that they've integrated the survey into their client intake forms. So we hope to gather more data as the situation unfolds and produce an updated paper. So next slide. So in terms of the findings, so among the migrant workers who were still at the country of destination, they had told us that they are well informed about the prevention measures of COVID, what COVID-19 is, what are the symptoms, and how this is contracted. So 98% of them said they're well informed, but less of them were certain about what to do in case they contracted or someone they know contracts the virus. So they don't know what to do, the immediate steps, where to go, and who pays for it. Is it them, their employers? So among the respondents as well, 89% of them were actually still employed. And again, this was between March and April. Among those still employed, 32% reported work-related problems or abuses related to, they were compelled to work during the lockdown, or they were pushed to take unpaid leave. Documents were kept by the employers as a way to force them to continue working. Some were threatened that their contracts will be terminated. And we also got reports of harassment and violence in the workplace. 33% said that there were insufficient personal protection equipment at their workplace. And among those who were unemployed in the CODs, 97% of them said they were not able to access any social security support, either in the country of destination or country of origin. So among the migrant workers who had already been able to return, we had asked them why they'd returned. So many of them, 47%, chose to end their contract prematurely, they themselves, because they were worried. Mostly their reason was they were worried about their family, so they just wanted to go home. 24% said their contract was about to end and needed to end, so they decided to go. And then 16% said that their employer ended their contract prematurely, either permanently or temporarily. So 93% who had returned were quarantined upon arrival, and 23% of those had reported issues in the facilities. Lack of food and heat stress were the top concerns, but also poor hygiene in the facilities. The facilities were crowded, they had to share sleeping areas, and they also reported feelings of isolation, depression, and other mental health issues. We had asked them what their plans are. In the short-term plan, they said 52% said they'll stay home, rest, be with their family. 20% said they'll find a job at home, maybe open their own business or work in their family farm. And 5% said that they will try to re-migrate as soon as possible. And this is true for especially the ones who were only temporarily retrenched. And then among our partners in Myanmar, they had asked what their long-term plans were, and 58% said that they will migrate, most anticipating they'll be able to get their old jobs back or go back to their former employers, and 28% said that they will migrate. And it's interesting to see that there were more men than women who said that they will re-migrate. Next slide, please. So this was just a quick visual representation of the issues in the quarantine facilities. I think we can skip. So next slide, please. And this one, I just wanted to highlight the issues that the migrant workers shared, what they encountered upon their return. And here, so as we know, at the start of the crisis, when government started announcing that they will lock down, days before they actually did, migrant workers rushed to the borders. I mean, this is true for Thailand with land borders, to be able to return before the lockdowns were actually imposed. So most of the borders were actually closed or partially closed around end of March, early April, with limited options for returnees, who are then subjected to health checks and quarantine. So the migrant workers who said that they experience higher transportation costs, higher than what it was before COVID. So they were affected by the restrictions of movement, the cross-border, but also within the countries. And the waiting times to be able to cross the border were quite much longer than usual. And some had said that they were stranded at the border. We had also observed that a lot of the transportation hubs were quite crowded, which was a concern that people rushing to the borders would contract the virus. So I wanted to leave it at that. So the question that I also wanted to point out was like, I wanted to pick up on is how do we recover, or how do we ensure that the new normal is a better normal? And what policies or programs and structures do we need to have in place to ensure decent work and safe and fair migration? So next slide, please. I'm going to try to quickly go through the recommendation. I know I'm almost out for time, but the most immediate is that we recommend that we need to continue supporting migrant workers, ensuring that they receive their due wages, social security, and other benefits arising from their past employment. We need to assist migrant workers in finding new employment. We need to address the specific needs of women and the sectors of the economy, particularly the informal economy, that are most affected by the COVID-19 crisis. We need to ensure the inclusion of returning migrants and the families of migrants in social protection schemes and the relief measures, going against the perception that they're better off. And we need to ensure that they have access to interpretation services and that women migrant workers particularly can speak to women service providers. The other thing I wanted to highlight as the most immediate is that we need to ensure that there's a humane and health-focused treatment of undocumented migrant workers, that we separate immigration enforcement policies from public service provision. And this is to encourage migrant workers to seek immediate health care. Because as we know, fear of arrest and detention may push undocumented migrant workers further into hiding, which has negative consequences for their own health and increased risk of spreading COVID-19 to others. And next slide. We also need to put top priority on access to accurate information, health services and testing and PPEs, safety from violence for women to ensure quality essential services, making sure that shelters remain open, hotlines remain operational, for example. We also need to have a certain consideration when it comes to occupational safety and health, ensuring, again, PPE, proper sanitation facilities, adequate physical distancing. And we also need to look at the area of gender-based violence and harassment at work, again, particularly for, say, the migrants, for example, migrant workers living with their employers. We also need to ensure for the quarantine facilities that they have adequate safety measures and that there's care provided related to their mental health issues. And overall, that they are safe from exploitation, violence, and harassment. And next slide, which is my last slide. We recommend that we develop or strengthen protocols to respond to crisis situations. And here in ASEAN, we know that there are certain countries, that the Philippines, that already had a crisis response protocol. But I think we need to look at this in terms of the new context of face with COVID. We need to also establish protocols and guidelines for the recruitment and deployment during the new normal. And I understand the Indonesian government has also started to work on this, trying to look into which countries, safe countries, they can open up to redeploy workers. Particularly, government should put into place cost structures that respond to the emerging needs around COVID. So, for example, if there's a need for medical screening, but we also need to make sure that these recruitment costs are not passed on to migrant workers, and that any recruitment related costs and fees paid by migrant workers, who have not been able to deploy, the payment should be returned to them. And last, the last is I really just wanted to highlight that we need to address the structural flaws. Improving housing for migrant workers, equal treatment with nationals in social protection, and the recognition of domestic work as work. So thank you very much. Sorry, I went a little bit.
Thank you very much, Kat. I think your data, for example, on ASEAN migrant workers is sometimes really an eye-opener, that we have nearly 7 million workers coming from the ASEAN, coming from the ASEAN to the ASEAN. Okay, wait, I have to start my video. Sorry. The numbers that you have presented are, of course, quite an eye-opener. And I think also what comes out of your presentation very much is how many, the troubles that migrant workers face, not just at the countries of destination, but really the journey home. And as they get back home, they are also facing a whole set of issues, which we have never seen before in our whole migration history. And I think the quarantines and the lockdowns have all had their negative impact on the well-being of the returning migrants. All right. Then let's now move on to the last presentation. This is by Johanna Son, who is Bangkok-based with Reporting ASEAN.
Okay. Do I share my own screen? Okay. Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. So this is just to say a little bit of where I'm coming from, because I think I'm the one from a different species from everybody else who's spoken in this discussion today. So I'm a journalist following regional issues. And so we try to train other journalists in like putting a regional perspective into our national stories. And in a sense, I think as migration shows, they're no longer purely local stories, because everything is like connected. I also wanted to just say that since March, I with a colleague, we've been like volunteering our time to do infographics around COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. So again, it's that regional picture, because I think we understand our own situations better when we see like how our neighbors are doing or not doing. Yeah. So next slide, please. So being in storytelling, I thought I would collect a bit of like what has the last few months been like in terms of media reporting on migrant issues. So we have a mix. So we have some that many of you have, the discussants have spoken about, like people returning. There are too many people returning compared to the capacity to check and quarantine everybody. And I know that in countries like the Philippines, they have been actually watching the numbers that they can take every day, how efficiently they can process that arrival. But you also see some signs of, some othering. If you look at the one called the myth of the filthy migrant, that's from Singapore. At the same time in Singapore, we've read a couple of good, encouraging stories around Singaporeans finally discovering that there are migrant workers around them, because their worlds are quite separate, no? So this pandemic seems to have opened a window of sorts. How long it will last, I think we don't know, but I think many Singaporeans are themselves realizing that they have been unaware and insensitive, to the very people who make Singapore's economic status what it is. Then there was this controversy about the top left picture about the Al Jazeera report called "Locked Up in Malaysia's Lockdown," and the Malaysian government was quite unhappy. I read that they interrogated some of the journalists who did this report, which is about almost 30 minutes. And the Malaysian official there actually says several times, which reflects, I think, what Lin said. He actually said they have no rights. The undocumented migrant workers, they have no rights because they have no documents. And so that's kind of like a very security-based viewpoint that you still see in this region, even if maybe there are some good signs. This one, Indonesia praises Malaysia for cooperation. I felt was okay, at least they kind of is Indonesia reaching out to its own migrant workers, according to this story, and they asked the help of the Malaysian government to help get to some of their own citizens. You also see that it says here the Thai government says it wants Cambodian migrant workers to stay on, which is also, I think, a reality. So, I mean, all of them like sort of combined together, I think, to make a couple of points clear. One, which is that despite all the problems, I think people and government officials for sure know that their economies need the migrant workers, maybe even more than before. I was just thinking that even if you thought back to 5, 10 years ago, some of the things you see today that relate to migrant workers were not there. For example, um, when you go to Singapore, and when you traveling to Singapore, say in the last 7, 8 years compared to before, you see a lot of migrant workers like in the public spaces. They're not, in homes as domestic workers, just as that. They're servers, right? They sell stuff everywhere. They're much more visible. So, you could also argue, I guess, that to a certain degree, they're much more integrated now. So in Thailand, for example, when you go to an ATM machine, the languages will offer you Burmese, right? So that tells you something about the degree of integration, if you will. So, however, I think that the pandemic and the stories that we've seen also raise some questions. And so, if I looked at it from a storytelling perspective, there were some questions that were coming out in my head. So, next slide. Yeah. So what I tried to do was like to try to get some answers to the question, how many people are we talking about? We all know that many, 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 many have returned, but exactly how many? So I found that there was like difficult to just get from one source, but I collated a couple of stuff from different reports. Some of these are UN, some are local media reports, but this figure was kind of mind-boggling. It says, and this was as of early April, over 700,000 migrant workers left Thailand to go home to see Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And that was early April. So you kind of think what's happened now, right? And then there were the other reports of like individual reports. So Cambodian Ministry of Interior gave its own figure. That's a lot too. It's a lot. And then there were some like reports here, reports there, but still a lot. And if you look at the Lao, I was surprised by the Lao one, that the labor, it said there that the labor ministry expects 1 million to return. And Laos has 7.75 million people, right? So I'm kind of remembering the question posed by the Chilean health minister when he had to resign. He said something like, how well do we know our own societies? Because maybe we don't, and maybe receiving countries don't either. So far in Thailand, where all of them come, so there was this figure said, they're allowing extensions of stay for an estimated 1 million people from neighboring countries, which was a relief to many people, not only because of the risk of queuing up at immigration offices, but it tells you a little bit about number. But visa stay extensions don't answer everything, no? Because if you're stuck and you don't have a job, and then in Thailand, the visa paper is different from the work permit papers. No, so that's sort of, it struck me that the numbers are huge. So it has to be, we have to go by that it's over 700,000 by now. Yeah. So next slide, please. So if we look at the receiving end, Thailand being, as always, the magnet for migration. Yesterday, as I think Jeffrey said, they officially announced that in the additional 5 groups that they identified would be allowed to come into Thailand, they listed 2 migrant worker categories. It's not everybody. If they give priority instruction to construction and food processing, which again tells you a lot about the need of the local economy. And although Thailand has not had a strict lockdown since maybe 1st of July, when the last like serious restriction was lifted. We are still in phase 6 technically. The thing is, so people are asking what are the details of that announcement, because they said that non-Thai nationals coming in, you also need to be quarantined 14 days, you need to do testing, etc. So there's a whole question around what does that announcement mean, because we didn't, the details yesterday didn't go into, is there a difference if you're a migrant worker, what exactly do you do, and who's going to cover the costs, etc., etc. So, second point is, I was telling Tetis the other day, I mean, as a journalist, you kind of realize that we don't really know how many positive figures there are among migrant workers. Again, there are anecdotal reports, but I mean, I was thinking that the definition, our definition of our nation states also need to go beyond our physical borders, right? I mean, so the Filipino nation is much more than everybody who's there, who has returned. We surely don't forget our nationals who are abroad. And when we speak of the national interest, I mean, that's included too, which we often also forget, maybe forget. So some of the official figures, I think, are also instructive. There was a webinar last week around impact on like Mekong communities, and Ajana Rumon from Chula shared these figures which I wanted to listen to. So yeah, officially we're saying 2.8 million migrant workers, majority obviously from Myanmar. And this figure struck me. In Bangkok, over 600,000 people are migrants. That's a lot. Much more than I thought. I mean, because you see, these figures, I think, I was thinking that, you know, if people knew them, maybe they'd understand better. And that's a way, in a sense, of countering some of the othering and the discrimination. Because I think people don't really realize, and figures do a lot to, you know, to give a more accurate picture for sure. So when I heard her speak, I was thinking that, so maybe it's not a fictitious feeling. This, you know, when you walk in the streets of Bangkok, it's still pretty quiet, despite the fact that malls are open, everything is supposed to be open. It's really quiet. So I was thinking maybe it's not imagined feeling. Maybe there are really less people in the Thai capital, even if you consider the fact that there are still a number of people staying home. And then there are 50,000 people who have border passes, so they work in the border area. So these are like mostly with the Burmese border and the border in the south, and then in Cambodia. So she was saying if you add them all together, easily, probably 3 million or more. She gave the figure of 60,000 jobless, and they identified where mostly there are garments, construction, metals, and plastics. So again, the demand is really more in the, maybe in the food processing part. So that's sort of on the receiving end. And earlier on in the pandemic, there were some statements from government officials saying, like, addressing migrant workers and saying you shouldn't worry if you feel sick, you should go for testing, etc., etc. But Jana Rumon was saying it's not that simple, because people, of course, worry about the status. You cannot take that away from them. I haven't seen also figures about positive migrant workers here. It seems like they can find some at the border. So they found several, for example, from the ones who were trying to cross from the south in Songkhla. So then they get some, or some when they return, like some from returning from Myanmar have been found to be positive. So it's kind of like hit and miss in that sense. Next slide. Yeah. So, I mean, it's become fashionable in a way, even among journalists, to criticize ASEAN for not doing this, not doing that, saying this, whatever. But I wanted to go a bit beyond that. I mean, knowing the organization as I do, that when I say ASEAN has not been much of a factor, I'm not trying to assign blame. I'm just saying that if you read the news and you talk to people, very few people think of what can our ASEAN do. I mean, it's not your first organization that you go to, no, to look for solutions, right? So which I think says quite a bit. And however, I was thinking that maybe, okay, because being nimble and fast and quick to respond is not exactly ASEAN's habit. However, maybe on the operational or existential point of view, even just for the fact that how do we deal with a community where many are receiving, a lot are sending, some are receiving and sending. So you kind of think that maybe there should be a conversation going on. But is there a conversation going on? So if you look at this quote, there was a statement from the labor ministers, ASEAN labor ministers, on middle of May. These are the exact words: provide appropriate assistance and support to ASEAN migrant workers affected by the pandemic in each other's country or in third countries. So that was the only statement I found that mentioned migrant workers per se. There were some June Leaders ASEAN Summit. Not much either. I mean, I think a lot of the discussions have been around like PPEs, small business enterprises, etc. And if you are following some of the ASEAN news, ASEAN Day is not far ahead, August 8th. And the ASEAN initiative, I don't know what you guys think, but I found it a bit like there's an ASEAN online shopping day on August 8th. This is the chosen initiative to revive, they said, or to encourage e-commerce in the region. There's even a website for it, and they kind of use the shopping promo 80808 2020. So that's where you are. At the same time, I was thinking like, what ASEAN has a lot of old mechanisms, I mean, I'm far from an expert from that, but through the years, I kind of remember there's something called, for example, an MBDS, Mekong Disease Surveillance System. So I was thinking that maybe there's something in the ASEAN cabinet that can be used. Maybe it doesn't need to be like some major thing, but I mean, I'm sure a lot of these cross-border things aren't new. I mean, COVID-19 is new, but some mechanisms, maybe there are something. And then, there are TB screening stations at several border points. So, is there a way of adapting that, right? I mean, there's already a recognition that, where people cross the border, there is a need for some of these things. So I was thinking that I wonder if there's something happening there. And then I wonder if our own governments are helping our migrants somewhere else. Are we able to? Are the host countries doing it? We've heard a bit. And then I know there's a lot of reliance on international organizations. Is there even, I think some of the other speakers have mentioned a bit, like, is there even just at the level of becoming a clearinghouse for our migrant workers? Because I mean, there's a lot of them. You cannot separate them in a sense from your economy anymore. So like, why don't we just make it a little easier so that like a person will know what he needs or she needs to go somewhere, what she cannot, and you avoid double things, triple things. And maybe the concept of a travel bubble, maybe they can talk about the migrant workers first, or a migrant travel bubble, if you will, or some kind of mutual recognition of certificates or labor clearance or fit to fly. Because I mean, everybody now, I think the receiving countries are feeling the need because they need these people to recover, right? So, I mean, if it's also in your self-interest, then maybe some of the mechanisms, even at the operational level, can be there. And obviously, undocumented workers, well, yeah, is a question mark. So I only think I had just one more slide of, more questions. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the earlier one was more kind of looking at gut issues, if you will, bread and butter. But I think the pandemic also raises a lot of questions about, we all talk about a reset button, a restart thing, right? So I don't know, is there a rethinking going on about, can we look at what is the shape of migrant work after this, given that clearly you need them? I mean, and there was a discussion like, would, for example, unemployment figures going higher, would, for example, local Thais want to take up some of the work? And some are saying they're not sure they will. So it's not such a simple thing as well as saying, let's kick them all out so that our local people will take the work. And it probably is not such a straight, that's not probably a straight line equation. So yeah, I was saying that if it's in economy's self-interest for recovery, then I don't know why don't they do this kind of talking multilaterally, right? And then it's been said that the new currency of any country is health capacity and the ability to respond to a health emergency, and to knowing that if you get sick there, you have a way. Yeah. So in this equation, if health currency is the new gold bar, if you will, where do the migrant workers come in? Because the pandemic is such that you cannot keep yourself safe without the other person being safe too. And the virus does not care about your legal status in any case. So, you know, there's kind of a larger question beyond it, like what does this do to the understanding so far of the kind of economic integration that we're following, which has largely been, yes, on the cheap labor is more efficient kind of model. And the fact that ASEAN opened the doors first to supposedly skilled labor. But you see, what is the problem now and what is the priority they're giving? They're also giving it to migrant workers because they need them. Okay, so yeah, development model, yeah, is there too. But again, when I read, I was reading through the summit statement, there wasn't really much of that kind of thing. So finally, I need to say a word about the lack of data that we need. And as journalists, I think that there's a big need, super lacking, big need for statistics, whether at the country level or something that you can put together. I know from speaking to Thetis that the Philippines has been having a hard time, but I think you need to get them because it helps you respond to what you need to respond as well. And I think a lot more figures around, for example, some of the slides that Katz showed, for example, about percentage of labor force which is foreign. I bet you many of them, those countries, their nationals don't know that. So, you know, what I'm saying is that raw data, yeah, does a lot of this campaigning as well, no, from the perspective purely even of storytelling. And I'm like kind of right into statistics now, so I kind of realized that, yeah, this is kind of a big hole. And then I looked at ASEAN.org. They have a page for statistics. They don't have their own statistics on intra-ASEAN migration for work. What they have is data sets about visitor arrivals, tourist arrivals, that kind of thing. So I think that says a lot. They also lack gender aggregated data, by the way. And third, I need to say that, you know, especially at a time where, you know, pandemic, many journalists ended up having to look at figures, health issues, laws, which they maybe on an everyday basis don't. And they're looking at dashboards and they're looking at like charts and stuff. They do need better skills to tell these stories better. And that includes the migrant workers picture as well. I think that's it, like mainly for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanna. I think it was very useful for us. I mean, to get, in effect, almost like a journalist's view of what the messages are that are being shared across the region, and how these messages, in fact, the information has been so woefully lacking. I'm going to start off with the questions already that have been here. Are already posted here, and some start off really with, and I'm going to start off with among the latter questions, which would be migrant health. And here's something from Renzo Ginto saying that from a migrant health perspective, we must also give attention to the disproportionate impact of direct COVID-19 infection on low-skilled migrant workers, undocumented, and also migrant health workers, and the limited healthcare access among these migrants in their countries of destination. Universal healthcare isn't universal if migrants are left behind in the age of COVID-19. This is really a comment. There is also a agreement with Johanna here that that advancing migrant health must be a regional priority for a highly mobile and dynamic region in Southeast Asia. However, there is tension. Expanding healthcare entitlements to non-citizens is a contentious issue among ASEAN member states. Although the comment here says that the European Union has already addressed this, and that countries are more open to increased mobility of health workers through mutual recognition arrangements. But our ASEAN team in the ASEAN Secretariat, of course, is very undersourced. And that there are also, another comment is that there are other regional mechanisms that are available. There has been a long-standing proposal to establish an ASEAN Center for Disease Control. The African Union and the European Union already have one, and the ASEAN still doesn't. And hopefully that COVID-19 gives a strong impetus to get one started. Just to let you also know that we are running a little bit out of time. We will extend this webinar for a few more minutes to be able to allow for more question and answers. I hope those who won't be able to stay, thank you for joining us, but I hope many can stay so that we can continue just a little bit longer the webinar. Here's a question on addressed to all of you. To what extent are these state responses appropriate from the point of view of social scientists or international development advocates? I mean, I think most of you have answered the question, but maybe I'd like to give a round of responses here. What do you think of the current responses of the individual states to situation of migrant workers during this pandemic? Maybe a few sentences. Shall we start with you, Yun?
Before that, can I highlight some of the question in relation to whether ASEAN has this specific mechanism for pandemic? What I've learned so far, the ASEAN has established the ASEAN Working Group on Health Emergency, which will be able to address the issue of pandemic now and later. So I think compare with the previous outbreak, ASEAN is rather hit by this COVID-19. So they decided to come up with a working group on the health emergency. The function is to coordinate, to come up with some possible cooperations, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it might be something that any regional organization is actually envisioning. Joanna's questions in relation to what ASEAN is doing. I'm not defending ASEAN, but that's also the question of many in terms of migrant workers. I've checked the document. I agree that less word or less term mentioned in relation to migrant workers in the official document. But on 10 June, the ASEAN ministerial meeting on social welfare and development, mitigating impacts on COVID-19 on vulnerable groups. So migrant workers has been considered as part of vulnerable group in ASEAN, and they come up with this 7 action to have a cooperation among member states to provide the essential goods and services, protection of their rights, allotting the budget for them, maximizing the use of technology, recognizing the need of to address digital divide. So among the vulnerable groups that ASEAN has identified, migrant workers, elderly, person with disabilities, women, children. So I think there are a number of, it's very long long list. My experience in ICHR, certain words sometimes fail to arrive at the leaders' text because they've been pick and choose on certain issues. But when it comes to sectoral bodies, then we can expect something, but also something more detailed. But that's also can be perceived as the priority of the leaders. I mean, if because the statement of the leaders was on 25th of June, and this statement of from the social ministerial meeting on social welfare and development was actually 10 June. So actually, the leader statement can bring the ideas from or repeat the ideas from the MMSWD into their statement. I mean, so I don't know, maybe lack of political will. In terms of your question that is on responses from government, I think the government of Indonesia had been criticized by civil society of not looking at the in detail how to respond the need of migrant workers. There are a number of regulations, there are a number of protocols, there are a number of efforts to bring migrant workers back and quarantine them for 14 days. All costs have been paid, but still the migrant workers in destination countries continue to complain that they did not get support and help from the representative of government in that countries. So, but I see number of efforts to revise, to improve this kind of services. We also saw Ministry of Foreign Affairs continue to be very quick in addressing number of issues like the seafarers issues that we had a couple months ago. So there has been improving services to address the need of migrant workers, but still we still have, because a lot of migrant workers out there, so migrant workers still feel that they are not reached out by the government.
Are there others who wish to join in this conversation?
I can say a couple of things. Yeah. To the question, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has tested the limits of our current labor migration structures and policies in place in the national level, bilateral level, at the ASEAN level, as we've been talking about. And I think the governments are working as best as they can with what they have, with the current structures in place. But I think that this COVID pandemic has also exacerbated issues that were already there, before COVID. And I think it just highlights all the more what issues we need to address now. I've already said it, so, but just wanted to enumerate a couple of things. So social protection for all migrant workers is one of the biggest issues, the portability of these coverage. And coverage also by the countries, the governments of the countries of destination. We know in ASEAN, actually, most of the countries of destination do cover migrant workers. But the question is, how do they access this? It needs to be more clear or simplified. It's also brought out, again, the issues of migrant worker accommodations. The procedures for return and repatriation during crisis. I think we also know, like, for example, in the Philippines is a stretch, the welfare system and the budget in the country to bring the citizens home. There's also a lot of questions about their reintegration programs and whether we could really absorb the migrant workers that are coming home who may not wish to, re-migrate. And again, I agree with our last speaker on data. I think all the more it's brought the issue of how much we need data, not just to collect data, but also to inform our policies, ensure that it's disaggregate according to age, sex, and the sectors, to really fully understand the context of what's happening what sectors our migrant workers, returning migrant workers can reintegrate into in the labor markets back home.
Any other who would want to join? Lin? You're muted, yeah. Lin, you're muted.
Malaysia as a receiving country, I guess I must say that I'm very concerned. Firstly, the reality is that the government is struggling to cope with rising unemployment, and the people are struggling to, there is clearly a move away from a very tolerant attitude to migrant workers, a need for migrant workers, whether legal or undocumented, to a much more xenophobic, anti-migrant attitude. And I see that this is not going to change very easily in the broader context already in the Malaysian case of the long-standing need to look at, to take a hard look at Malaysia's migrant policies. And I was very struck by Joanna's picture of the attitudes towards migrant workers. And it reminded me of the fact that Al Jazeera had a report on the abuse of migrant workers in the under the pandemic. Yeah. And the Al Jazeera reporters were actually hauled up by the police, and there have been very strong reactions against that. And this is just an example of how the attitudes are changing. And in the longer term, I think it will, I really do not see, I see clearly that there will still be a need for migrant workers, but it will have to be a much clearer view of exactly the sectors they are needed and exactly the need to improve their conditions. For instance, it will be, I think, a while before the manufacturing sector that has been dependent as part of global supply chains will be really up and running. And the attitude of Malaysians who previously did not want what they called the dirty, difficult, jobs will now be changing, because any job is better than no job. So I guess my concern is that it will, that those who think that the government itself has started a program called Locals at Work, which is going to subsidize Malaysian employers to replace migrant workers with locals, and also to incentivize employers to adopt automation and new technology in place of what they call cheap labor. So these changes will have to be taken into account under the new normal in terms of how we assess Malaysia as a destination country.
Thank you. Jeff, would you like to add to that?
Just a short one in the case of the Philippines. So the situation is unprecedented and obviously very difficult. So it's difficult for policymakers to get a handle of things. But given that, I think if you're going to make a judgment, I think you have to say that so far, it has been quite lacking, judged in terms of the slow repatriation, and then the long delays and suffering of the migrant workers who have been repatriated. It took a very long time to get to their home communities. What makes judging the adequacy more difficult is the lack, as has been said, the lack of data. So what we know so far from the data available from POA, for example, is how many have been repatriated and where they come from. But we don't know, for example, the breakdown by sex or by occupation, which would have given us a better idea of how much need they actually have and how much better they can be served. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there others who wish to add? I think we've covered quite a bit of the questions. I think there is maybe a last question I should raise here. Are questions relating to women and women migrant workers. There is a question on how much of mental health, I mean, this is actually not just women, the mental health issues that are faced by our migrant workers. And the second is in terms of how far, for those migrants who are still in their workplaces in these countries of destination, how much of the arrangements for their health, continuing health, occupational safety and health, their uniforms, what is the role of the trade unions in this? Have they played any role in this recovery or this protection of the migrants? I think that will be the last question I have. So something on the women migrant workers, mental health issues, and of course, protection to those who are currently still on site. Anybody with views on that? Or have we covered that? Lin?
Okay. Something very quickly on,
I'm sorry, Jeff, you wanted
something very quickly on the mental health. I looked at responses across many countries, including outside ASEAN. And there were actually only a handful that had responses having to do with taking care of the need of on the effect on the mental health of workers. So very few. And specifically to migrant workers, I did not actually see any. So if there's any response towards addressing the mental health needs of migrant workers, more women migrant workers, there's probably hardly any at the moment.
Thank you. Lynn, you wanted to add? Thanks, Jeff. Lynn, you wanted to add to that? Unmute, please. Lynn, you're still unmute.
Oh, sorry. I just felt that I hope you will allow me just to end up by clarifying that I hope I did not give too negative a picture of attitudes towards migrant workers in this country. I think it was more to highlight the struggle of trying to deal with an economic crisis that is clearly affecting nationals and a changing attitude towards migrant workers. But on the other hand, I must emphasize that civil society groups and many individuals and organizations recognize and certainly employers recognize overall the importance of migrant workers, and on a humanitarian basis have been providing a lot of support to the migrant groups. So I hope I just needed to be able to balance the picture. Thank you.
Okay. Perhaps I should close the questions at this point. I'm going to try to do, I've been asked by the organizers to do a quick summary, but I think given the very rich discussions or presentations that we've had this afternoon, it would really be quite impossible to do a good job of that. I am going to try to highlight 2 or 3 things, perhaps. The first being that, first, the big surprise, and maybe it should not have been a surprise, is the number of intra-Asean migrants that we have. We do have in our community nearly perhaps 8 million, 7 to 8 million migrants amongst ourselves. And it does require, and these migrants have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. While we have heard of, while we know even before COVID that our migration systems have been failing, we've also seen some progress during the past years. But I think the pandemic has halted, in fact, or reversed some of the gains that we have made in terms of understanding the value and the contribution of the migrants. And we need to find a way to get that going, because ultimately we are still one community. And we will be seeing a displacement of maybe 1 million people, maybe 700,000 to 1 million people displaced amongst our countries. And that would have a tremendous impact on their health, education of the households, the well-being of the migrants, employment and incomes. And so it is important that countries, I think individually and jointly, work to respond to those gaps that it's being shown so strongly now in these periods of the pandemic. It has also been very clear that migration, the impression I have is that while all of our countries are aiming to try to stop the flows or halt the flows, even here in the Philippines, there's a lot of discussion on return and reintegration and to remove all this dependency on foreign employment, for example. But we all know that that shift is not just going to be that easy. It's the same way as in Malaysia. The dependency on foreign workers, and in Thailand, the dependency on foreign workers is not going to be removed very easily. And given the aging populations, we will still need migrant workers in our midst. But it will have to be under, I think, as Lin had so, and all of you had so carefully said, that this will have to be under better conditions. The demand for social protection, for economic protection for our migrants. We have known about this for so long, but I think it's become clear that we cannot waste our time we cannot keep on postponing these types of decisions and these types of thinking, and that it has gotten a greater urgency in these times. I'd like to end also with a statement of Yu Yun when she says, look, all of the countries are looking at recovery plans. All of our states have these recovery plans. And I think we should start also thinking about what should our national recovery plans and the regional recovery plan include as it comes to migrant workers. Again, recognizing that they have now become really part of the fabric, part of the economic and social and political fabric of our community. So I think there are many more recommendations all of you have made, but I think, again, it's too rich to try to share it. But I would like to thank all of you for your participation in this webinar. I hope that all of those who have joined us today have also found it as useful as I have. Thank you very much. I will revert back to Stella. Stella, I hope you're still with us. Have I lost Stella in this process?
I'm sorry. Some technical difficulties here on my part. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. So it has been a very rich and informative discussion this afternoon. And as we end this webinar, I would like to thank our esteemed speakers, Ms. Yuyun Wayaningrum, Ms. Lin Lim, Mr. Jeffrey Ducanes, Ms. Joanna Son, and Ms. Catherine Loss for sharing their rich insights on our topic this afternoon. Likewise, I'd really like to thank Tetis Mangahas for having skillfully moderated the discussion today. We also would like to thank the officers and staff of the Philippine Migration Research Network and the Philippine Social Science Council for making this webinar possible. We would also like to thank our viewers today, especially those who have sent in questions and comments, for joining us today in this timely and relevant discussion. I would like to take this opportunity as well to invite everyone to join our network of migration researchers and scholars. Okay, to join us in the Philippine Migration Research Network. The annual membership fee is 500 pesos for members based in the Philippines and $25 for members based outside the Philippines. Okay, as you can see on the screen, those of you who are interested in joining PMRN, the link to the online membership form is shown on the screen. For those of you who would like to view the webinar again, to go over the very rich discussion we've had today, a recording will be available shortly on the PMRN's Facebook page. Tune in also on this page for announcements on future webinars and other PMRN activities. We would also like to request everyone to accomplish our brief evaluation form to help us further improve our webinar offerings. The link to the evaluation form is flashed on the screen and is posted in the comments section. Certificates of attendance will be issued upon submission of the evaluation form, and the evaluation form link will be open until 11:59 p.m. tonight. Finally, I would like to thank the members behind the scenes who have really done a lot of work in preparation for this webinar. We'd like to thank Mr. Miguel Caraan, Ms. Ena Tagiam, and Mr. Wilson Villones of PSSC. Again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and good day and mabuhay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.